Tiana Johnson pulled up to the iron gates of Oakwood Estate and couldn't help but smile. After 15 years of hard work, countless late nights, and 3 promotions, she had finally done it. The beautiful 5-acre property with its colonial-style mansion was now hers. "Ms. Johnson, would you like to do the honors?" asked Mr. Patterson, the real estate agent, handing her a sleek remote control. Tiana pressed the button, and the large gates slowly swung open. She drove her black Range Rover up the winding driveway lined with oak trees. The house came into full view, 3 stories of elegant architecture with large windows, a wraparound porch, and perfectly maintained gardens. "I still can't believe this is mine," she whispered to herself. At 34, Tiana had risen through the ranks at Tech Fusion, one of the country's top software companies. Starting as an entry-level programmer, she now held the position of Chief Innovation Officer. Her app development team had created 3 of the company's most profitable products. As Tiana parked in front of the house, she noticed movement in the window of the house next door. A woman with blonde hair quickly pulled back from her curtains. Mr. Patterson walked Tiana through the house one final time. The large living room with its fireplace, the modern kitchen with marble countertops, the office with built-in bookshelves, and upstairs, 5 bedrooms including the master suite with its own bathroom and walk-in closet. "And of course, the crown jewel," said Mr. Patterson as he led her through the back doors to the patio area. The swimming pool gleamed in the afternoon sun. It was surrounded by lounge chairs, a hot tub, and an outdoor kitchen area. Beyond that lay the tennis court and a small guest house. "The previous owner spent a fortune on this backyard," explained Mr. Patterson. "The pool was renovated just last year." After signing the final papers and receiving all 6 keys to her new home, Tiana waved goodbye to Mr. Patterson. She stood alone in her new living room, taking it all in. The moving trucks would arrive tomorrow. Tonight, she had just brought an overnight bag, a bottle of champagne, and some takeout food to celebrate. Tiana opened the champagne and poured herself a glass. She walked from room to room, planning where her furniture would go. In the master bedroom, she opened the double doors to the balcony and looked out over her new property. She could see the roofs of the neighboring houses, all part of the exclusive Oakwood Estates neighborhood. As the sun began to set, Tiana noticed 3 women walking together on the sidewalk in front of her house. They slowed down, looking up at the property with curious expressions. One pointed toward the house and seemed to be asking questions. Another woman, whom Tiana recognized as her neighbor with the blonde hair, shook her head and made a dismissive gesture. Tiana considered going down to introduce herself but decided against it. There would be plenty of time for meeting the neighbors later. Tonight was for celebrating her achievement. She took her champagne to the back patio and sat on one of the lounge chairs, looking up at the stars appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would begin her new life here. What Tiana didn't notice was the blonde neighbor standing at the property line, taking pictures of her house with her phone, a concerned frown on her face as she typed a message to the neighborhood group chat. Someone new has moved into the Richardson estate. Has anyone heard who bought it? 3 weeks after moving in, Tiana finally felt settled at Oakwood Estate. The movers had placed all her furniture. She had unpacked most of her boxes, and her home office was fully set up. She had been so busy with the move and work that she hadn't taken time to enjoy one of the property's best features, the swimming pool. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather. The sun shone brightly, and the temperature was warm with a gentle breeze. Tiana decided today would be pool day. She changed into her favorite blue swimsuit, grabbed a large beach towel, and carried her laptop and phone outside to the pool area. The water sparkled in the sunlight, looking cool and inviting. Tiana set her things on a lounge chair and tested the water with her toe. It was perfect. She dove in gracefully, enjoying the refreshing sensation as the water enveloped her body. Being a strong swimmer since childhood, Tiana did several laps before floating on her back, eyes closed, soaking in the sunshine and peaceful moment. This was worth every penny, she thought, feeling completely relaxed for the first time since moving in. After about 20 minutes of swimming, Tiana climbed out and toweled off. She settled into the lounge chair with her laptop to check some work emails. As she typed, she felt the strange sensation of being watched. Tiana glanced up and noticed her blonde neighbor standing at the fence line between their properties. The woman wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she was staring. She had one hand on her hip and the other holding her phone to her ear. Tiana smiled and waved politely. "Good morning." The woman did not wave back. Instead, she turned around quickly and walked back toward her house, still talking on her phone. That was odd, Tiana mumbled to herself, returning to her emails. 30 minutes later, Tiana was startled by the sound of car doors slamming in her front driveway. She walked around the side of the house to see 2 police cars parked there. 2 officers, one tall man with a serious expression and a shorter woman, were approaching her front door. "Can I help you, officers?" Tiana called out. The officers turned, looking surprised to see her coming from the backyard. They exchanged a quick glance before walking toward her. "Good morning, ma'am," said the male officer. "I'm Officer Reynolds, and this is Officer Chen. We received a call about a possible trespasser on this property." Tiana's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "A trespasser? Where?" Officer Chen cleared her throat. The caller reported an unknown woman using the pool at the Richardson estate without permission. It took Tiana a moment to process what was happening. The Richardson estate was the former name of her property. Someone had called the police because they saw her swimming in her own pool. "I'm Tiana Johnson," she said calmly, though she felt her heart racing. "I purchased this property 3 weeks ago. This is my house and my pool." "Do you have any identification with you, ma'am?" asked Officer Reynolds. "Of course. My purse is inside. I'll get it for you." As Tiana turned to walk back to the house, she noticed movement at the fence. Her blonde neighbor was watching the scene unfold, phone still in hand. Their eyes met briefly, and the woman quickly stepped behind a large tree in her yard, partially hiding herself. In that moment, Tiana understood exactly what had happened. Her neighbor hadn't bothered to learn that the property had a new owner. She had just seen a black woman swimming in what she thought was someone else's pool and immediately called the police. Tiana took a deep breath, straightened her back, and walked toward her house with dignity. She would handle this situation with grace, but she wouldn't forget it. Tiana returned to the officers with her driver's license, the property deed, and closing documents neatly organized in a folder. She had prepared this folder for just such an occasion. Experience had taught her to always be ready to prove herself. "Here's my identification," Tiana said, handing over her license to Officer Chen. "And these are the ownership documents for the property, showing the transfer from the Richardsons to me 3 weeks ago." Officer Chen examined the documents while Officer Reynolds looked increasingly uncomfortable. From the corner of her eye, Tiana could see her blonde neighbor still watching from behind the tree, now joined by another woman with red hair. "Everything appears to be in order, Ms. Johnson," Officer Chen said, returning the papers. "I apologize for the disturbance." Officer Reynolds cleared his throat. "We received a call from a Karen Whitfield about a possible trespasser. She described someone using the pool without authorization." "That would be my neighbor, I believe," Tiana replied, nodding supply toward the women at the property line. "The one hiding behind the oak tree." Both officers turned to look. Karen Whitfield quickly stepped back, pulling her friend with her, but it was too late. "Would you like us to speak with her?" Officer Chen asked. Tiana considered this for a moment. "Actually, yes. I'd appreciate if you let her know that I am the legal owner of this property. It might prevent future misunderstandings." The officers nodded and walked toward Karen's property. Tiana watched as they approached the women. Though she couldn't hear their words, she could see Karen's face turning red, her hands moving rapidly as she tried to explain herself. The red-haired friend slipped away, hurrying back toward her own home down the street. While the officers spoke with Karen, Tiana's phone rang. It was her assistant, Marcus. "Hey boss, just checking how the move is going," he said cheerfully. "Well, I just had the police called on me for swimming in my own pool," Tiana replied, keeping her voice even. "You're kidding me," Marcus exclaimed. "Please tell me you're kidding." "I wish I were. My neighbor apparently didn't get the memo that a black woman could afford this place. Do you want me to come over? Or call someone? Your brother, maybe?" "No, I'm handling it," Tiana said, watching as the officers walked back toward her. "But I think I'll take you up on that offer to host the company meeting here next month. Might as well let everyone see where their chief innovation officer lives now." After ending the call, Tiana turned her attention back to the officers. "We've spoken with Ms. Whitfield," Officer Reynolds said. "She claims there was a misunderstanding. She says she wasn't aware the property had been sold." Even though moving trucks were here for 2 days, and I've been living here for 3 weeks, Tiana replied dryly. Officer Chen gave her a sympathetic look. We've clarified the situation. She understands now that you are the rightful owner. As the officers prepared to leave, Tiana noticed several other neighbors had emerged from their homes, standing on their front lawns, watching with curious expressions. Ms. Johnson, Officer Reynolds said before getting into his car, if you experience any further problems, please don't hesitate to call the station. After the police left, Tiana stood in her driveway for a moment, aware of the neighborhood eyes on her. Instead of going inside, she walked deliberately back to her pool, picked up her laptop, and resumed her work exactly where she had left off. She would not be made to feel unwelcome in her own home. As Tiana typed, she began formulating a plan. If her neighbors wanted to know who she was, she would show them, on her own terms. The following morning, Tiana was enjoying her coffee on the front porch when she spotted Karen Whitfield walking up her driveway. The blonde neighbor had traded yesterday's workout clothes for a flowery dress and was carrying a large wicker basket covered in cellophane. Tiana set down her coffee cup and watched Karen's approach. The woman's face showed a mixture of embarrassment and determination. "Good morning," Tiana called out, keeping her voice neutral. Karen hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. What can I do for you, Mrs. Whitfield?" Karen seemed surprised that Tiana knew her name. "I wanted to bring this welcome basket, and to apologize for yesterday's misunderstanding." She held out the basket. Tiana could see it contained wine, chocolates, and what appeared to be homemade banana bread. "That's very kind of you," Tiana said, accepting the basket but not inviting Karen to sit. "Though I've been here for 3 weeks now." Karen's cheeks flushed pink. "Yes, well, I suppose I should have brought it sooner." An awkward silence followed. A delivery truck drove by, momentarily taking Karen's attention. When she looked back at Tiana, she seemed to have gathered her courage. "About yesterday," Karen started, "I feel just terrible about the whole thing. If I had known you were the new owner." "You wouldn't have called the police?" Tiana finished for her. "Exactly," Karen said, seemingly relieved. "You see, the Richardsons never mentioned selling to. They didn't tell anyone they had finally sold the place." "To someone like me," Tiana stated flatly. Karen's eyes widened. "Oh no, that's not what I meant at all. It's just, well, we're very protective of our neighborhood. There have been break-ins before, and you saw a black woman enjoying a swim and immediately assumed criminal activity," Tiana said calmly, rather than considering she might be the new homeowner. Karen twisted her wedding ring nervously. "I made a mistake, and I'm truly sorry. I hope we can start fresh as neighbors." Tiana studied the woman before her. She seemed genuinely uncomfortable, though whether from true remorse or simply from being caught was hard to tell. "Mrs. Whitfield, I appreciate the gesture," Tiana said finally. "But I think it's important to be honest here. What happened yesterday wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was an assumption based on what you thought someone like me could or couldn't afford." Karen started to protest, but Tiana raised her hand. "Please let me finish. I've worked very hard to be able to buy this home. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Tech Fusion. I manage over 200 employees and a multi-million-dollar budget. And yet, my first month in my dream home includes having the police called on me for swimming in my own pool." Karen stared at her shoes. "I didn't know." "You didn't try to know," Tiana corrected. "You didn't introduce yourself when I moved in. You didn't drop off this welcome basket until after you embarrassed yourself with the police." A car pulled into the driveway next door, and a man, presumably Karen's husband, got out, looking curiously in their direction. "I accept your apology," Tiana said, softening her tone slightly, "and I'm willing to move forward as neighbors who respect each other. But respect has to be earned, Mrs. Whitfield." Karen nodded quickly. "Of course, and please, call me Karen." "Thank you for the basket, Karen. I'll enjoy the wine." Taking the dismissal for what it was, Karen turned to leave. She had only gone a few steps when Tiana called after her. "By the way, I'm hosting a small gathering next Saturday evening. A housewarming of sorts. You and your husband are welcome to attend, around 7. Karen's face showed surprise, followed by relief. "We'd be delighted." thank you. As Karen walked back to her house, Tiana picked up her phone. She had several calls to make. If Karen Whitfield thought she'd seen the last of her surprises, she was very much mistaken. The Oakwood Estates Community Center was busier than usual for the monthly neighborhood association meeting. Tiana arrived precisely on time, dressed in a professional navy blue suit. She carried a leather portfolio containing notes she had prepared after researching the neighborhood's history and recent projects. As she entered the building, conversations quieted momentarily. Several people glanced her way with curious expressions. Tiana had expected this and kept her head high as she walked to an empty seat near the front. "Is this seat taken?" she asked a silver-haired man who appeared to be in his 60s. "Not at all," he replied, extending his hand. "Walter Peterson, I live in the stone house on Maple Lane." "Tiana Johnson, I recently purchased the Richardson estate." Recognition flashed in Walter's eyes. "Ah, the Richardson place. Beautiful property. Been in the neighborhood 40 years myself, and that's always been one of the finest homes around." Before they could continue their conversation, a tall man with glasses approached the podium. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Baker, president of the Oakwood Estates Neighborhood Association. Let's call this meeting to order." The room quieted as Richard went through various announcements. Tiana noticed Karen and her husband sitting across the room. Karen gave her a small, awkward wave, which Tiana acknowledged with a polite nod. "Next on our agenda," Richard continued, "I'd like to welcome our newest resident, Tiana Johnson, who has purchased the Richardson estate. Ms. Johnson, would you like to introduce yourself?" All eyes turned to Tiana as she stood. She had prepared for this moment. "Thank you, Mr. Baker. I'm delighted to join the Oakwood community. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Tech Fusion, where I've worked for 15 years. Prior to that, I studied architecture and computer science at MIT. I'm looking forward to becoming an active member of this neighborhood." As Tiana sat down, she could hear whispers around the room. Walter leaned over and whispered, "Tech Fusion. My son uses your productivity software daily." Richard continued with the agenda. "Now, let's discuss the community pool renovation. As you know, we've received 3 contractor bids. The board is concerned about the high costs and timeline." For the next 15 minutes, various members voiced their opinions. Some wanted to delay the project, while others insisted it needed to be completed before summer. Tiana listened carefully, reviewing the project details in the meeting handout. When there was a pause in the discussion, she raised her hand. "Ms. Johnson?" Richard acknowledged her. "If I may, I noticed some potential issues with these plans," Tiana said, approaching the front of the room. "Before joining Tech Fusion, I worked briefly in architectural consulting. This design has some inefficiencies that are driving up costs." She placed her copy of the plans on the table and began pointing out specific areas. "If you adjust these dimensions and reposition the equipment room, you could reduce costs by nearly 20% while actually improving accessibility." The room fell silent as Tiana confidently explained her suggestions. Richard and several board members gathered closer to examine her notes. "These are excellent observations," Richard said, looking impressed. "Would you be willing to consult with our committee on this?" "I'd be happy to," Tiana replied. From across the room, Tiana noticed Karen watching with a surprised expression. Nearby, a group of women who had been giving Tiana sidelong glances now whispered furiously among themselves. As the meeting moved to other topics, Walter leaned toward Tiana. "That was quite impressive. The pool committee has been struggling with that project for months." By the time the meeting ended, several neighbors had approached Tiana to introduce themselves. An older woman named Dorothy invited her to join the garden club. A young couple with twins asked if she would consider joining the education committee. As Tiana prepared to leave, Richard caught up with her. "We meet on Thursdays to discuss the pool project. Would 7:00 p.m. work for you?" "That would be perfect," she replied. Walking to her car, Tiana smiled to herself. The community meeting had gone exactly as she had planned. She was establishing herself not as an outsider to be suspected, but as a valuable community member with skills and expertise to contribute. 2 weeks after the neighborhood association meeting, cars lined both sides of the street leading to Tiana's estate. She had sent formal invitations to everyone in Oakwood Estates for an open house event. The invitation mentioned light refreshments, a tour of the property, and a brief presentation about her plans to restore the historic gardens. Inside, Tiana made final preparations. White uniformed waitstaff arranged trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne flutes. A quartet played soft classical music on the patio. Large boards displaying before and after sketches of the garden restoration stood on easels in the living room. "Everything looks perfect, Ms. Johnson," said Maria, the event coordinator Tiana had hired. "Your first guests should arrive any minute." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Tiana smoothed her emerald green dress and went to greet her visitors. Walter Peterson and his wife Ellen were the first to arrive, followed quickly by the young couple with twins from the neighborhood meeting. Soon, the house filled with curious neighbors exploring the renovations Tiana had already completed. The previous owners let this place decline over the last few years, Tiana explained to a small group as she led them through the kitchen. "I've updated all the appliances and had the cabinets refinished rather than replaced to preserve their historical character." Richard Baker, the association president, nodded approvingly. "The Richardsons were trying to sell this place for what, 5 years?" "Nearly 7, replied Dorothy from the garden club. "They were asking way too much, especially considering how much work it needed." Tiana led the group to the back patio, where the swimming pool, the site of her confrontation with Karen, now sparkled under string lights. Several guests exchanged knowing glances, clearly aware of the incident. "I've always loved this view," Tiana said, directing attention away from the pool and toward the gardens. "Which brings me to my next project." She guided everyone to the living room where the garden plans were displayed. The original gardens were designed in 1935 by Elizabeth Carpenter, one of the few female landscape architects of that era. "I plan to restore them to their original glory, with a few modern sustainable elements." Dorothy clasped her hands excitedly. Elizabeth Carpenter. Her work is legendary among garden enthusiasts. I had no idea this property featured her designs. As Tiana began explaining the restoration process, she noticed Karen and her husband entering the room, looking uncomfortable but curious. Karen wore an expensive-looking blue dress and clutched her handbag tightly. "I've hired Greenfield Landscaping to begin work next month," Tiana continued. "They've worked on several historical restorations." "Greenfield? They did our botanical garden downtown," Richard commented. "They're excellent but not cheap." Walter chuckled. "Well, I doubt expense is an issue. I just learned that Ms. Johnson's team at Tech Fusion developed the virtual office software my company uses. My department would collapse without it." Several guests looked at Tiana with newfound respect. A man in glasses spoke up. "Virtual office. My firm pays thousands in licensing fees for that program every year." "You developed that?" "My team and I did," Tiana confirmed modestly. "It was one of our first major successes." The conversation shifted to Tiana's work, with many guests suddenly realizing they used products she had helped create. Others mentioned articles they'd read about her in business magazines. From across the room, Tiana could see Karen's expression changing as she listened to the conversations. The blonde woman who had once called the police on her was now learning exactly who her neighbor was. As the evening progressed, guests mingled throughout the property. Tiana overheard snippets of conversation about her success, her taste in home renovation, and how fortunate the neighborhood was to have someone revitalizing such an important property. When Karen finally approached Tiana, her demeanor had completely changed from their previous encounters. "Your home is absolutely beautiful," Karen said quietly. "I had no idea about your work or your plans for the gardens. It's impressive." Tiana smiled graciously. "Thank you, Karen. I'm glad you could come tonight." As Karen walked away, Tiana knew the neighborhood dynamics had shifted. She hadn't just shown them her property, she had established herself as someone to be respected, not suspected. The morning sun cast long shadows across Tiana's front lawn as she met with the surveyors. 3 men in yellow vests walked the boundaries of her property, placing small orange flags at specific points. "Ms. Johnson, could you join us for a moment?" called the lead surveyor, a middle-aged man named Frank. Tiana walked over, clipboard in hand. "Is there a problem?" "Not a problem, but something you should know," Frank said, pointing to a line on the survey map. "According to these original property records, your land extends about 15 feet beyond this fence line." He pointed to the wooden fence that separated her property from Karen's. "Are you certain?" Tiana asked, examining the documents. Absolutely. The Richardsons must have built the fence inside their property line years ago. Technically, this section of Karen Whitfield's garden is on your land. As they discussed the boundaries, Tiana noticed Karen watching from her kitchen window. Minutes later, the blonde woman hurried across her lawn toward them. "What's going on?" Karen asked, looking nervously at the orange flags placed in what she had always thought was her garden. Frank explained the situation, showing Karen the original survey documents. Tiana watched as Karen's face paled. "But that can't be right," Karen protested. "That garden has been part of our property for decades." "The documents are clear," Frank replied. "The fence was built incorrectly years ago." As this discussion continued, a black Mercedes pulled into Tiana's driveway. A tall man in an expensive suit emerged, carrying a leather briefcase. "Ms. Johnson, I'm Robert Williams from the County Development Office," he said, approaching the group. "I brought those historical property documents you requested." Tiana introduced Robert to Karen, who was still visibly upset about the boundary discovery. "Mr. Williams, perhaps you can help clarify something else," Tiana said. "I understand there's been some confusion about the access road behind our properties." Robert opened his briefcase and removed several large folded maps. "Yes, I brought those records as well. The private access road that serves the back entrances of 5 properties in this section is actually part of the original Richardson estate." Karen's eyes widened. "The back road? We all use that to reach our garages." "Yes," Robert confirmed, showing her the documents. The previous owners granted an informal easement to neighbors for its use, but legally, it belongs to the current owner of the Richardson estate, which is now Ms. Johnson. Karen looked stunned. "I had no idea. We've been trying to buy that road for years. The neighborhood association wanted to widen it." Tiana maintained a neutral expression, though this information wasn't news to her. She had already discovered these facts during her research before purchasing the property. "There's more," Robert continued, unfolding another document. "The Richardson property also includes the small wooded area between the houses and the water rights to the stream that runs through the neighborhood." By now, several other neighbors had gathered, drawn by the unusual activity. Walter Peterson approached with his morning newspaper still in hand. "What's all this about?" he asked. As Robert explained the situation to the growing crowd, Tiana observed their reactions. Some looked concerned, others curious. Karen stood silently, her earlier confidence completely deflated. "So Tiana owns half the neighborhood," joked a man Tiana recognized from the community meeting. "Not quite," Robert clarified, "but the Richardson estate was the original property in this area. Other parcels were sold off over the years, but these key elements remained attached to the main estate." Karen finally found her voice. "What does this mean for those of us who use the back road, or for my garden?" All eyes turned to Tiana, waiting for her response. This was the moment she could have taken revenge for how she'd been treated, demanding Karen remove her garden, restricting access to the back road, asserting her rights to the stream. Instead, Tiana smiled calmly. "Nothing will change for now. I have no immediate plans to alter the current arrangements." The relief on Karen's face was unmistakable, though Tiana noted it was mixed with something else, the uncomfortable realization that her access to her own property now partially depended on the goodwill of the woman she had once called the police on. As the neighbors dispersed and the surveyors continued their work, Tiana knew that the power dynamic in Oakwood Estates had permanently shifted. 6 months after moving into Oakwood Estates, Tiana's property was transformed. The gardens bloomed with carefully restored flower beds arranged according to Elizabeth Carpenter's original designs. Solar-powered lights illuminated stone pathways winding through the grounds. The once-neglected guest house now served as a fully functional office space where Tiana occasionally worked from home. But the biggest transformation wasn't to the property. It was to the neighborhood itself. On a warm Saturday evening, cars lined both sides of the street again, this time for Tiana's charity fundraiser benefiting educational programs for underprivileged youth. White tents dotted the back lawn. Local catering staff served gourmet appetizers while a jazz quartet played near the pool. "Tiana, this is extraordinary," said Mayor Phillips, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. "The foundation will be able to fund at least 50 scholarships with the money raised tonight." "That's the goal?" Tiana replied, smiling as she surveyed the crowd of 200 guests mingling on her property. The guest list included local business leaders, city officials, and most of her neighbors from Oakwood Estates. Walter Peterson chatted animatedly with Tiana's boss from Tech Fusion. Dorothy from the Garden Club led small tours, proudly explaining the historical significance of the restored gardens to interested guests. Richard Baker approached with his wife. The community pool is nearly finished, thanks to your suggestions. We've saved enough in the budget to add the children's splash area after all. I'm glad to hear it, Tiana said. I plan to host swimming lessons there this summer for kids from the downtown community center. As Richard moved on to greet other guests, Tiana spotted Karen Whitfield standing alone near the rose garden, looking uncertain. Unlike their first encounters, Karen was now dressed more simply, wearing a modest blue dress rather than her usual flashy attire. Tiana made her way through the crowd toward her neighbor. Karen, I'm glad you could make it, she said cordially. Karen seemed nervous. Thank you for inviting us. James is talking with some city council members about that traffic proposal. She paused, fidgeting with her purse strap. Tiana, could we speak privately for a moment? Curious, Tiana led Karen to a quiet spot near the koi pond, away from the other guests. What's on your mind? Tiana asked. Karen took a deep breath. I owe you a real apology. Not the awkward, half-hearted one I gave you that day with the gift basket, a genuine apology. Tiana remained silent, allowing Karen to continue. What I did when you first moved in was inexcusable. I made assumptions based on prejudice, plain and simple. Karen's voice trembled slightly. These past months, watching how you've contributed to this community, how you've treated everyone with respect, despite how some of us treated you, it's been humbling. Karen looked directly into Tiana's eyes. I'm truly sorry, and I'd like to ask for a fresh start. Not because you own half the neighborhood, she added with a small, self-deprecating smile, but because you're the kind of neighbor we should all strive to be. Tiana studied Karen's face and saw sincerity there that had been absent in their previous interactions. I appreciate that, Karen, she said finally. And yes, I'd like a fresh start too. Relief washed over Karen's features. Thank you. And I want you to know, I've joined the diversity committee at my workplace. I'm trying to educate myself to be better. Tiana nodded. That's a good step. Would you like to join me? I should greet the superintendent who just arrived. As they walked back toward the party together, Tiana reflected on her journey from unwelcome outsider to respected community leader. She had proven herself not through confrontation, but through quiet dignity, excellence, and generosity. Later that evening, as the event wound down and the last guests departed, Tiana stood on her back porch looking out over her property. The lights from the party still twinkled in the trees. The water in her pool, where this whole story began, reflected the night sky, peaceful and still. Tiana smiled to herself. This was home now. Not just the house and land she owned, but the community she had transformed through her presence. She had claimed her place on her own terms, with grace and determination that no one in Oakwood Estates would soon forget.